I feel actually a bit of an interloper after having seen such a beautiful visual treat of the three objects that I, in fact, have written about. But I feel that this presentation is really a testimony both to the openness of the Godrej archives in making available information and a testimony to the exhibition, which I feel is the kind of public history that cities in India really now need. So thank you, Vrinda, and thank you, Seth and Godrej Archives for having me here. The presentation is really a preview to my forthcoming book. I won't give you too many details, but it is certainly drawn from the book that I just wrote, as well as an invitation to reflect on business archives. What are these archives about? And the archiving impulse that has animated recent efforts by business houses to store their material and the challenges this material offers to a historian writing about them. There is a clear distinction between somebody who makes an archive, gatekeeps the archive, and the historian who uses the archive to tell a story which perhaps runs counter to the mission of the archive. So I hope the invitation sort of persuades you to think about this tension. Now, the presentation itself arises out of my personal experience of working with the Godrej Archives, as well as of engaging with the larger problem of the disciplinary credibility in relation to business history and its invocation of the archive. Business history is a new entrant in India, and as Vrinda said, really pioneered by Vijay Tripathi in this very city. And in a sense, it was somehow its formation was a little different from other kinds of histories that were written in India, particularly with economic history and cultural history. But yet, the archive was invoked as a kind of method to do business history. And I want to think a little bit about the business archive. Now, in keeping with the spirit of this exhibition, which I really see as an aid for public history and public humanities, I will have occasion to refer to the specific nature of an archive of manufacture, like that of the Godrej Archives, and what this holds for a historian of objects of manufacture of middle class consumption. What can the historian expect in an archive like this, and what kind of story can he or she come up with in this archive? Now, as we've just had a very brief, introduction to the Godrej Archives by the speakers before me, but let me just quickly say that business archives are actually relatively recent in India. It was in the 80s that the House of Tatas conceptualized the Tata Central Archives, something which took concrete shape in Pune in the 1990s. Godrej followed in 1997, as we heard. The centenary year of the organization saw the idea being mooted by Sohrab Godrej, who had the task of clearing old papers and decided to store them in a repository and alongside commission a 2-volume history of the company. So the intention was clearly to preserve the institutional memory of the family business, trace its beginnings, record its progress in post-independence India. At the core of this archival collection is the circular collection, which is really the core of the Godrej Archives, the Lal Bagh collection. It includes circulars issued from time to time by the sales department from 1942 to 1972, used to communicate policies, procedures, changes to various establishments, branch offices, stockists, dealers. It also included tender documents, introduction and discontinuance of product, product design, and sales strategy. Now, why do I mention this? I mention this because this is not just the most detailed collection in the Godrej Archives, but it contains that unique and non-duplicated archival document. And of special value to the historian, the user of the archive, to tell a story that may be quite different from the creator of the archive. Alongside this circular collection, which I use extensively for the book that I wrote, there are detailed catalogs, product descriptions, advertisements, publicity material, oral history collection that records, for the most part, the memories of old and retired employees, some personal family correspondence, contemporary business and marketing journals. The underlying rationale behind the archiving mission, as stated in the website itself, was to emphasize the role the company had played in the nation building process and to emphasize the modernist nature of their own agenda of manufacture and marketing. So, for scholars of history, the archive offers an unusual repository to consider multiple stories. You can consider stories of manufacture, design, consumption, and a lot more, including, for example, the whole idea of staging a middle class modern family, something that you wouldn't normally expect when you walk into the Godrej archive and see reams of material on technical design, on sales strategy, on product descriptions. But you go deeper, you realize that there is a different story to tell. Let me, however, begin by reflecting on why archives were so important in making or configuring business history as a discipline in India. I use the hyphenated term business history because for a very long time, practitioners in the subfield were happy to use the archive, could be case studies of companies, archives of families, but were a little hesitant to grapple with scholarship on the archive. You see, the scholarship on the archive really questioned the biases in the archive. So for some time, there was a sort of implicit enthusiasm about referencing the archive somewhat unproblematically. You know, we heard about the hagiographies that were written, and with the assumption that history then was equal to archive without the interpretive dimension that historians are familiar with as an integral part of their craft. Another underlying assumption was the sacrality assigned to numbers, to statistics, which was always equated with scientific empiricism and detached from the reality of power and politics. So this meant that for a very long time, business history, especially spearheaded by management institutes, were unwilling to grapple with issues such as caste, gender, colonialism, law, power, compared to the kind of nuanced studies that sociology and anthropology brought to the table. So there was, for some time in the early years, an uncritical embrace of the archive, which was to do with the documentation of a single business house, a single family, and a reluctance to interrogate the assumptions of the archive. However, this really changed and has been changing. And there are very important exceptions. For example, we have the recent work on the Tatas by Rainau, who is able to write very critically about India's premier business house and comment on the archive, he suggests, whose primary objective was to assert its evidentiary value that would safeguard company interests when faced with litigation. So the idea of the archive as something evidentiary is something that he takes very seriously in his work on the Tatas. The archives of the Tatas, he also suggests, served as a venue for inducting new managers in the history, culture, and ethos of the group, and to reproduce power and authority by the constant reinvention of history and memory, producing real challenges for historians and users of the archive who had to develop very creative strategies to read them and attempt a counter-history. Rainau did this brilliantly himself in his work on the Tatars, and as a result, he adopted the strategy of reading along the grain of the archive, not as biased sources, but as sites of anxiety. And very interestingly, he focused not on the bigwigs, but on the medium thinkers, on right-hand men, Minu Masani, Badshah, and set out to disaggregate the Tatars as a stable entity and bring our attention to all those middle-level men whose actions made the corporation that it was. Now, turning to the Godrej archives that I personally have been working with, two tendencies were immediately evident in the first year that I actually looked at the material. One was that the archives was intended largely to frame the nationalist Swadeshi vision of the founding members and how that was carried through the decades of independence, affording the company a template for framing their own self-representation. And two, and this was very important, to communicate the salience of steel and steel objects as an idiom for modernization, to which the business house was committed, and which they wanted to disseminate more widely among a growing class of consumers, of customers at that time. These two motives permeate the collection of the archive, whether they are to do with communications of sales managers or with descriptive catalog of finished products or advertisements or the periodicals and newspaper collections that the archive holds. Additionally, there was a conscious projection of family values of the founding family onto the corporation, which was often almost always likened to a family wherein loyalty was to be assiduously cultivated. This was done in official directives, in the oral history narratives that were built up over time. So it really required a historian to read this narrative carefully, critically, to find out what was actually happening. It was not as though the archives did not document the challenges that the corporation faced. Labor militancy, complaints, the sales department had to respond to, after sales service, lack of spare parts. In fact, a lot that did not add luster to the company's profile. But to that extent, the Godrej archives have followed principles of due diligence in making available and granting access to researchers without any conditions on their interpretive use. And I really want to place on record my appreciation of this. My own interest in using the archive is to write a history of industrial manufacture, especially that of three manufactured objects and their afterlives. The larger context in which manufacturing experiments were undertaken by Godrej and Boyce, whose goods became household names and sought after by an emerging middle class, was central to my story. I was interested in analyzing the emergence and success of a business firm over time through a period of chronic steel shortage, government oversight, and a narrow consumer base that changed with liberalization in the 1990s, and studied discrete moments of consumption by focusing on three objects that embodied the Godrej experiment. So while one part of my work focused on manufacture, on steel acquisition, on design, on refinement, the second was on the semiotics of objects, of the meanings they were inscribed with, of the meanings they assumed with the end user or consumer. So what the company projected onto the goods and what the meanings were that the consumer, himself, herself grafted on was something I was interested in. The challenge was to be very alert to the reproduction of the archival logic in generating and an interpretive history, and not succumb to the temptation of re-emphasizing what the corporation said about its projects, but rather to place them in context and reflect on the very difficult negotiations that the company had to make in realizing its manufacturing vision. This enabled me to write a more nuanced history of manufacture. I wrote extensively on the problems the corporation faced in acquiring raw material in a period of shortage, in getting access to international design, in telling the story of the emerging license permit quota Raj from the perspective of a manufacturing corporation and the strategies it came up with in working the system. It was not an easy system to work with. Every circular, therefore, that spoke of shortages of steel, of enormous difficulties about procuring steel, had also something to say about the reorganization of the company personnel authorized to deal with the government and about their sustained ability to keep sales up in response to demand. It demonstrated the aggressive sales strategy that the company adopted and the pressures the marketing department were under, not to speak of the importance about the network of stockists and dealers played in sustaining the success of the corporation. The story of the objects then took me to the second protagonist, namely the consumer. My choice of three objects, namely the Storwell Almira, the tubular chair, and the refrigerator, was also guided by the changing preference of the consumers and by the fact that these objects represented very different moments in the history of consumption. While the Storwell embodied the wishes of the cautious consumer who remained ambiguous about consumption, the office chair appealed to the confident bureaucrat and the office goer, and the refrigerator to the private customer whose investment, however, did not succeed in making it immediately a mass product. The consumer base for these products remained the middle class, whose ideas about lived space and furnishing matured over time. The manufacturer, in turn, responded to these shifts of taste and preference and experimented with new designs, articulated marketing strategies, and expanded the aesthetics of modernism. We find thus, in the case of an object like the Storwell, the pitch used was the aesthetic of austere modernism. While with the chair, especially in its later avatar, the discourse was about cosmopolitan fashion. However, it was not as though these ideas rippled through each of the components making up the archive. The circular collection was always gloomy in its forecast, emphasized the challenges that the company faced as far as steel supplies were concerned, the difficulties salespeople found in pushing the product. On the other hand, the publicity brochures and descriptive product catalogs referred to the great innovation of design and the adaptiveness of the company to redesign its products to suit the consumer. These also conveyed the values of the company that were transposed on to the brand value of the product, giving weight to the impression that investment in a Godrej product was for a lifetime. The company was in fact compelled to advertise its products carefully, blending together apparently opposite elements, scarcity and abundance. Thus, not surprisingly, while the narrative of scarcity dominates the official correspondence of the company, there is also a push for responsible consumption. It is here it becomes imperative to read the archives carefully and critically, teasing out from the official circular collection of the company the impression of accelerated production and distribution of hundreds of products through a network of agents and dealers to every corner in India. The narrative of steel shortage and scarcity is offset by that of the sheer volume of goods produced and distributed, testifying to the company's participation in industrial growth. You also had oral narratives compiled by the company offering a twist to the official narratives of the company, of the corporate archive. For one, they helped me animate the formulaic instructions the company communicated to its personnel and subordinates. I'm thinking of Johnny Fernandez, an old employee who specialized in refrigerators, who mentions this aspect in great detail and, very jovially. Referring to the dealers' network, he pointed out how critical it was to the success of Godrej and the sales of its products. Also, the oral testimonies emphasized the personalized nature of company operations that could not be described as purely professional or managerial. Employees not just extolled the working conditions, but insisted that the organization was like a family, echoing both the Swadeshi narrative of the company as well as the perception of Godrej's close association with the government. It was an unmissable fact that the interests of the company were tied to the support of the government, wherein personal associations mattered. Many employees commented on the personal intimacy that the family enjoyed with some officials, even as they critiqued the restrictive policies of the government that inhibited the company's organic growth. As an archive of manufacture and marketing, the historian can expect to find very unusual material. Beautifully produced product catalogs vie with newspaper advertisements, in-house marketing strategies put forward in workshops to convey to the historian a deep history of objects and their meanings, constructed, calibrated by the manufacturer, and consumed or rejected by the customer. Both find mention in unusual ways, and it is up to the user to find the tale. In many ways, the archives bring two institutions together, entities together, the corporation and the market, and stands for a larger ecosystem of consumption and manufacture. Once the logic of the archive is apparent, the historian is able to plot the material history of objects within a larger system of political control, manufacturing impulses, and changing consumption ideals. As I said, at the core of the archive is the sales department, the circular collection, and this is something that one uses very extensively, particularly when looking at this store well. To wrap up the point I'm getting across here is that the logic of the archives shape the histories one writes, and the challenge is to avoid the mere reproduction of that logic. How one is to do this, especially as the archive talks only about certain issues and others remain at the core of the historian's conundrum. Without having to argue from silence, the archival grain, think, remains the best strategy we have to comprehend the power relations implied and embedded in the collection and enabling the user to ask a set of unexpected questions. Let me quickly illustrate this point by the three objects that I've studied. As I said, I wrote a history of the store well, the office chair, and the refrigerator in its various avatars, especially Puff, the new technology that was used. In tracking the history of the store well, especially through the years of independence and thereafter, I was struck by the overwhelming and overarching emphasis of Swadeshi as an ideal. It was easy enough to refer to the Swadeshi imperative, something that the company's founders abided by deeply, used for their promotional campaign, and something that runs through the activities of most of the business houses. But there are layers to this narrative, and this is something the historian has to intuitively grasp at and demonstrate when you move from being a recorder of material to a storyteller. I found there were two stories to be told. One was the making of middle-class consumption ideas, and two, tracking the formative moments in this consumption idea, especially after the two world wars, and how they were ordered around security, longevity, and even ambiguity about consumption. So this is something that one really has to very carefully plot. And two, the making of the store well into a mass product. It's not something that was really restricted to the elites. Middle class consumption of material goods had a much longer history. From the late 19th century, we know how ideas emerged to critique ostentatious display in middle class homes, but also to simultaneously help make informed choices about buying household items. I'm relying on Prashant Kidambi's work on buying and consumption in sort of late colonial India. Buying or consuming material goods was a strong manifestation and experience of modernity, but it had to have specific vernacular dimensions, something that manufacturing houses had to take cognizance of, whether it was to integrate eccentric features to please the local customer, or to project steel as the material of the day. There was the larger conviction in using steel, which became more than a metaphor for modernity. It was convenient, it was durable, it was material of the moment. But it was also part of global preference, wherein steel was equated with industrial modernity and entered middle class consuming imagination the world over. The most striking feature in the history of the store well, however, was in its conversion into a mass product. And it is here that the circular collection of the archive generated tremendous information. But there were paradoxes. There is a persistent lament about steel shortage and exhortations to salespeople to embark on aggressive marketing. There are some wonderful circulars to the sales people in the exhibition here. You have to do everything. You have to make luxury a necessity. There's an aggressive sales strategy. There are also projections of continuous expansion that warrant an explanation. So with steel shortage, there is also tremendous explanation. How does one do this? Is this only distributorship, or is this the ability of the manufacturing house to leverage with the government and work the steel quota system effectively? So, notwithstanding prices that removed the Storwell from the reach of the poor, there is no doubt that the Storwell became a mass object, profoundly Indian, and played a role in the commercialization of Indian society. The overcoming of customer resistance to owning a cupboard in a new medium, steel and not wood, was evidently a huge achievement for the manufacturing company that through branding and advertisement and network of distributors managed to create a mass market for the middle class. There's a new narrative that is produced by advertisers who create a lexicon of meanings for consumers who found new meanings in using the product and giving it their own associations. Sometimes exceptional circumstances like burglary or impoverishment enhance the value of possessing an object like the Storwell, which became almost a necessity. This then entered the world of gifting and celebration rituals that introduced yet another element of meaning and manipulation. All these elements came together in the journey of the Storwell after it came out of the assembly line to become an iconic object of possession, desire, and display. When it comes to the second object, the celebrated office chair, the catalogs provided for me the key to decoding the history of the object, both in terms of design, manufacture, and consumer preference. However, it also helped me tell the story of space in modern India. The catalogs really talk about transformation of office spaces in modern India and help us understand the imperatives for use and by default for manufacturing design. Space was a huge constraint, and the need to stack and pile effectively meant the chairs had to be of a particular kind while being ergonomically effective. At the same time, the chair, like the typist chair, embodied the feminization of stenographic labor, just as the introduction of the executive chair indexed the hierarchical structure of the modern office. With liberalization, the idea of office spaces changed, and with it, the chair as well. The open office seating formula acquired traction, although it took some time for this to become pervasive. The material changed, design became global and cosmopolitan. The marketing message also changed, and we come across the ergonomical mantra. I was interested in probing the context for this transformation and why it was so important to invoke it. Do we see this as a manifestation of the new capitalism that Petteri talks about? One that sought to persuade users and workers by selling the idea of happiness and ease by designing a cool office space with furniture that dissolved formal behavior and produced freer conversations? Or was that just an illusion? I did not have answers, for the catalogs can be read and interpreted only to a point, but what was clear was the attention given to the principle that was executed in actual design and in all probability helped the company acquire a huge share of the market. Let me finally turn my attention to the last object in my study, namely the refrigerator and its entry into middle class homes. Here, my archival base was informed by advertisements, consumer complaints about the appliance, and problems of energy shortage and office projections. What is interesting and a point of contrast is that the refrigerator could not penetrate markets in the period that I'm looking at as effectively because of slow demand and poor energy availability. This had two consequences. It remained a luxury item, subject to very heavy duties, and was expensive. This, and secondly, the investment in refining technology remained stagnant for a long time. I was, however, curious to see what kind of narrative the company produced in making the refrigerator a product to be desired. The company deployed the message of hygiene, the value of fresh foods, to increase its consumer base, and alongside entered the discourse of an ideal, happy middle class family with new desires, new aspirations. So, starting out as a history of cooling technology and manufacture, I turned to looking at objects and the staging of middle class families with the Godrej refrigerator featuring as an important member: the father, the mother, the child, and our little Godrej. Further, the child became, probably for the first time, the consuming subject in advertisements. Of course, I argue that in the late 70s and early 80s, there was nothing crass about consumption. Given the entrenched middle class with their middleness in terms of income, value, and taste, were the drivers of new images of consumption, validating what they saw as correct ethical choices. The assumption at work here was that middle class consumption patterns would ultimately generate aspirations among the lower echelons to pursue a desirable material life that subsumed the use of essential electrical household appliances. So the last chapter looks at shifts in consumption values, and then, of course, post liberalization, the aspirations of high end luxury items and how that resonated with new icons, film stars, and glamorous celebrities. So, from the child, you have Preeti Zinta with the cool look in the refrigerator. So, by way of a tentative conclusion, the presentation then was intended to highlight the creative ways in which archives may be used to tell a story that go beyond the original mandate of the gatekeeper. I came to the archive to try and find material to think about three specific objects and the ubiquity they enjoyed in our contemporary lives. Deep diving into the archive, my interest expanded as I became interested not just in the way the objects appeared in advertisements, but in the way they were designed and conceived of, which brought me constantly to the manufacturer. The objects I chose were determined by their mundaneness and the enduring hold they had over the public imagination. But in attending to the nitty-gritty of manufacture and circulation, I had to look more deeply into the context in which industrial production operated in very difficult times and in synergy with consuming preferences. This was, I must admit, facilitated by the sheer diversity of material in the Godrej archive. I've tried to flag this diversity in each of the chapters, dealing with the objects and trying to abide by the historian's craft of braiding fact with interpretation, of piecing the puzzle as bits and pieces emerge. Thank you.